welcome everybody to our part 2 of our VBA series that is aimed for graduate student mother scholars. And this talk is being co-hosted by SWS, which is the Sociologists for Women in Society. And we have Dr. Barrett Katuna with us today to help welcome her organization and explain a little bit about why we endeavored to do this project together. But before I dive into that, I wanted to give a quick preface to the meeting of why we're here and why we thought it was important to arrange this panel. Our talk today focuses on ways to fix the leaky pipeline with an emphasis on systems of inequality, not personal change. We will focus on low-cost, practical solutions that offer real impact and suggest ways to use established protections to get more support. We decided to offer this talk because too many mother scholars feel undersupported and often unseen on their campuses. Issues of transparency, culture, legal protections, and navigating sometimes unwelcoming systems that have not acknowledged the needs of mother scholars all come into play. Well-meaning supervisors may want to advocate for and provide mentorship, but can be at a loss regarding what is most needed. We are here to help. As we begin, please note that the session is being recorded. Towards the second half of our meeting today, we will be welcoming questions and comments from all of you in the audience, but of course, throughout the panel talks, you're more than welcome to chime in using the Q&A button that's on the bottom of your screen, or you can use the chat box, which is pretty typical for Zoom. And so if you have any questions, please feel free to put those in now and we will certainly get to them. But if there's something that comes up while we're talking, you're free to do that as well. So first things first, I wanted to hand over to Barrett Katuna the floor so that she could introduce her organization and talk a little bit about her purpose in being here today as well.
Great. Thank you so much for the introduction, Katie. And so my name is Barrett Katuna. I'm the Executive Officer of Sociologists for Women in Society. It's an organization of sociologists that was established back in 1971. So we're celebrating our 50th anniversary this year, which is really exciting. And we're not just sociologists. We have members who span all sorts of disciplines. And we're open to all who identify as feminists, who support our mission. And one of our major elements of our mission is transforming the academy and helping students at all levels and faculty members at all levels. And we have applied sociologists as well who are a part of our membership. And so Katie and I spoke, I guess it was back in spring or maybe a little bit earlier than spring this past year, and just about ways that we can support our populations. And we have a little bit over 1,100 members right now, and we're an organization that's growing. In the midst of the time that we cannot actually physically be meeting in person, we typically host 2 meetings a year, major meetings. One is in the winter, one's in the summer. The summer one always takes place in conjunction with the American Sociological Association meeting, which this year we decided to do ours a little bit earlier since we were in a virtual space. So we had ours from July 8th to 9th. And this summer, many of our members will be able to now attend the American Sociological Association meeting. But we have so many different opportunities throughout the year for now more than ever through Zoom. And so we're responding to member needs on all levels as they're trying to complete dissertations, working with advisors who are not being responsive, or how do you manage childcare in the midst of everything that's going on right now. So, I'm really grateful for this opportunity to partner with YAMAS, and I really see this as an opportunity for further engagement. So if anyone is interested in learning more about Sociologists for Women in Society, I'm happy to answer questions. I'll put my email address in the chat. And we are offering complimentary sponsored memberships this year. There is a sliding scale for based on income for membership, but we really want to provide these opportunities for mentoring and peer support to all. So please let me know if you have any questions, and I'll turn it back over to Katie. Thank you. Oh, you're on mute, Katie. I'll put myself back on mute now.
Baird and I had met a few months back, and clearly I think for those that know SWS or IMS, you can see the overlays in terms of our interest in supporting and mentoring young scholars, but also hopefully being a source of information for those that are sort of more established in their career and can help be the sort of leadership that we need at a lot of campuses around the world, truly. And so IMS has pretty much a tighter focus on mother scholars specifically, but Barrett and I thought that this would be an excellent opportunity for our organizations to work together and get to know our work and share our work together in a way that will hopefully reach more people. So with that, we assembled a panel of amazing women that we're so happy to have with us today. We have Jessica Levito, Mairi McDermott, and Catherine Riley. And I'm going to hand this over so that they can each offer a quick introduction for themselves. And then we're going to circle back again and we're going to start having a conversation with each person. But I have found sometimes it's more helpful to know kind of who's in the audience and who's on the panel stage so that we can kind of navigate the conversation a little bit better and ask pointed questions that may target their expertise. So with no further ado, Jessica, would you like to lead us off?
Hi, thank you, Katie, and thanks for inviting me to be a part of this panel. I'm excited for the conversation today. Also, I've been a member of SWS and now IMS, so it was fun to see the coordination and the coming together. I am a sociologist. I have a PhD in sociology where I focused on social psychology from Kent State. I'm an associate professor of sociology at Kent State University, the Ashtabula campus. One of the interesting parts about the Mother Scholar, and I think one of the reasons that I have found myself here and doing this work is I have informally been doing this work for about 21 years. I was a undergraduate mother, and then I was a graduate student mother, and then I had two on the tenure track. So I have two young children now. So I was the young mother at 20 and then an advanced maternal age, old lady mother, as they like to tell you every time you go to the doctor when you're over 35. But I'm a social psychologist and I study emotion and mental health. And so it's very interesting how there's this intersection of all things, and COVID really exacerbated that. My work right now is looking at the impact of COVID-19 on mothers. I most recently did a survey and got about 750 responses. So I'm digging through that data, both extended response. I am a quantitative researcher by trade, but becoming a qualitative and mixed method scholar as we see, and absolutely becoming action oriented. So I appreciate this opportunity to really put all those things into action.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Mari?
Hi, and it's such an honor to be here with all of you, Katie, Barrett, Summer, for your coordinating and amplifying these important conversations that I wish I had, as I too was a graduate student mother, an identity that I'm only now beginning to claim for myself. I never identified that way when I was going through graduate school. I'm Mari. I'm an associate professor of curriculum and learning at the Werklund School of Education at the University of Calgary. And I'm joining you today from Okinsis, the Blackfoot name of what we now call Calgary, as a guest on the traditional territories of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, where I am attempting to raise my children in good relations on these lands and with these peoples and through the histories that we all carry with us, particularly when the ongoing colonial violence is enacted on Indigenous, Black, and racially marginalized communities, work in part through a rupture of family. That's not the only site of violence, but it's one particular site of violence, taking children away from mothers through mechanisms like the residential school system, where we're finding unmarked graves of 215 children and youth who were taken away from their families. The 60 scoop, this is all kind of a very Canadian context, but it was also happening in the United States under different names. And now presently with the child and welfare services, and who gets to decide who is a good enough mother to continue to raise their children. As I was saying, I had both of my children during my doctoral program. I defended my thesis while my 2.5-year-old played outside the door, and my 6-month-old slept on my partner's chest down the hall so that I could nurse him as soon as I was done. I was an international student, and this came up in the paired sort of a session that you had where one of the members of your last panel was talking about being an international student and the supports or non-supports when you become pregnant and how you have to make that visible or known or not known. And as an international student, didn't think I had the right to take a leave or request a leave because I needed to keep my visa, meaning I needed to stay a full-time status, right? So just kind of all of those complexities coming into play. And it's only been now that I've started to immerse myself in motherhood scholarship that I'm recognizing these are not two separate worlds. And I loved what you said, Jessica, that you've been informally studying it. And I realized it was very much present with me, but I'm now amplifying it. And so in many ways, the way that I mentor my graduate students, the way that I have conversations with incoming students, whether they're working directly under me or not, if they find out that, you know, my work on mothering, I try to make it very explicit because I'm also trying to understand the structures and systems that shaped my experiences as a graduate student mother. So I'm very much interested in this, in kind of going back and relearning my own experiences, but also as a way to continue forward and supporting future generations of grad student moms. So pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much, Mari. And Catherine Riley.
Oh, well, thank you for having me on the panel today. It is a joy to be here and speak. This is one of the first times I get to speak about the research that I just submitted for publication 2 nights ago. I'm really excited. I also, like everyone else here, it sounds like, was a graduate student while pregnant at the same time with my first child. And I graduated, and then I graduated early and had the child. And now I have had 2 more since then. I teach part-time at Wake Forest University in the communication department, teaching public speaking and rhetoric, persuasion, those areas. I'm teaching class right now. And I usually focus on all things public address or visual rhetoric related. However, over this last probably 10 years, I've paid more and more attention to colleagues, friends, myself, anyone who had children while in school or were not able to have children because someone told them they couldn't or they shouldn't. I've been really sensitive to comments that I've heard, things that were told to me or told to others. And about 2 years ago, I started thinking, well, maybe I could do a research project over this. And I knew that Title IX was supposed to protect pregnant and parenting students, but I never really heard anything about it. So I started this project, and then I submitted it for publication, and the reviewer said, maybe you should pursue other genres. I was like, other genres? And I was like, okay, maybe they mean a book. So I was like, okay, I'll apply for a book contract. And then I got one. I was like, okay, I'll apply for a bioethics grant. And I got one because it's really important. What we're talking about here is not just a matter of like feminist research. You could look at it from any angle, including bioethics. So that's what I'm doing. And I have a book that's under review right now, under contract, and it looks at Title IX and what schools say they're doing to comply, and then what students are actually experiencing, and how does it all match up in our schools and compliance, and what is compliance, and what do schools and students really need to be supportive spaces, as you can see, supportive spaces. That's what I've been doing the last 1.5 years while also having a baby at the same time. And I'm really excited to talk about it today and some of the things I've learned. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. So yes, we obviously have a wealth of wisdom and knowledge that we're hoping to share, but that doesn't mean that all the information needs to come from us. So again, as a reminder for those that may have joined a couple minutes late, we welcome comments and questions via the question box that's on the bottom or else the chat box on the side. But first, we have a few questions for Jessica. So you also, in your copious free time, head up Facebook's PhD Mamas, or is it Mama PhD? I always mix those up.
It's PhD Mamas.
PhD Mamas. So, and I'm sure that you've read thousands and thousands of stories from graduate student mother scholars who have a host of good and maybe not so good things to say about their universities and their experiences. So what stands out to you in terms of the concerns and pressures that you think mother scholars are facing specifically, and how might those be different than other folks that are going through graduate school?
Okay, so one of the things that we know is that graduate students have less resources and they assume they have less power. And I say there's this assumption because once you get on the faculty side of things, you realize that graduate students are not powerless. Though when I was a graduate student, I certainly felt powerless, or at least not powerful. And so the big distinction between, other mothers in academia and graduate students is this kind of power dynamic within the institution. I love being the second part of the two-part series because this came up. I listened to the first part, and there was this idea of gratitude. We have this gratitude for being there. And I entered school with my son was in kindergarten when I started my PhD program, and so there was this idea that there was a space created for me. I definitely didn't feel like I belonged at first, and so there was this idea of appreciation for just being there. But some of the concerns that we have seen that come up within PhD mamas is this lack and need for a sense of community. And it's one of the reasons that we're here today, for this idea of making the invisible visible, and really kind of patching some of those, I don't even want to say little holes along the pipeline because they're gaping holes. We need a sense of community. I think online spaces like PhD mamas, groups like SWS and IMS have really created both informal and somewhat formalized structures to help mothers along the way feel a sense of community. I would encourage mothers in graduate school to reach into those communities, find a space. There's a number of groups online in different capacities. And I think that some fields do better than others at supporting, but this is interdisciplinary. So even if you're a graduate student in STEM, you may find that social sciences has a space to really help mentor your progress through it. Other concerns that have come to light is the lack of proper mentorship. And it can be downright toxic. And this is where I encourage people to, you have a scholarship and you're working with an individual, but if that individual is not supporting you as a whole, you may want to look elsewhere for some of that mentorship, because you deserve to be treated as a human being and not just as a student, as awful as that sounds, because student is a whole human being. Funding and the scarcity of funding in academia right now is a concern, and that's obviously a concern that's coming up. Informal structures for funding are important, and I know that there's some organizations that are providing funding for graduate students and funding for graduate students to attend conferences. Childcare institutions can also do that. The lack of childcare is a concern that comes up repeatedly. COVID has only exacerbated that. And one of the things, well, there's actually two things, false advertising of programs. So this idea that you can complete a program in 2 or 3 years, and then the reality is you get there and the systems are not in place. And one of the things that I caution, and I'm a professor at this point, I'm not an administrator, and I understand the pressures that institutions are under right now as far as having students come into their programs, but really some truth in advertising is important. And so when you're looking at programs, talk to students that are already there, find how long on average it takes students, not the advertised. So not the advertised price, but the actual time in which to degree completion. And one of the things that comes up, and in my own experience that I've had, is the rigidity from the professors and rigidity from faculty. My own experience, I earned tenure 2 years ago, and I've started taking some postgraduate certifications. So I'm taking courses, especially now that I can do it online. That has really opened up the opportunity for me to work flexibly. There's a course I wanted to take in diversity in higher ed. And I had emailed the faculty and said the class was a remote class, so I needed to be there synchronously, but it was butting up against the time where I was going to have to pick up my children. I said, well, I will be listening the last 10 minutes. I'm going to shut off my camera if that's okay. And she had responded, and there was some, kind of in a roundabout way, but one of the things that stood out to me was it could be detrimental to my success in the course. And so I'm not taking that class. And so one of the things that I think is important, and I emphasize in the group, and I hope that we emphasize here, is we really need to encourage our diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives to include mothers and caregivers, because that's essential. And I believe that this faculty member just had an oversight possibly to how she was being exclusionary in a class about inclusion. Oh, you're on mute.
a lot of us have stories very similar, I think, and that was part of the reason for, I think, hosting this talk today was partly so that people do know that these are problems that a lot of people are facing. This is not unique just to you or somehow your fault, but that these are systemic issues that people in many various places are experiencing. But one of the things that sort of I flagged when you were talking was the idea about how COVID has shifted some of this. And I know that you've done extensive research on how graduate students and how academic mothers in general have been impacted by that. So I was hoping you could share a little bit more about where you are with that.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm in the preliminary stages, and I hope that I can get beyond the preliminary stages. I believe there was true tears shed when there was no mask mandate in my children's school, which means my children will not be going back to school. They'll be doing virtual school or homeschool or some combination of both because the environment will be safe. So I was so excited for them to go back to school and for me to have some time to really dig into the data. But the data originated with my colleague in English and an IMS member, Nicole Wiley. And Nicole's work, I had met her in a mentorship program, and she was, as soon as COVID had happened and sidelined, everybody had gone online. She wanted to do a survey, surveying academic mothers, and specifically about policy. And I know this overlaps with some of the work she's doing with you, Katie, and that you'll talk about later. But I'm a survey researcher, and she said, would somebody take a look at this survey? So I know early on, I helped with the survey, but I couldn't commit because of everything else going on. I couldn't commit to the research and the scholarship. And so she collected that data and then really encouraged me to get back into it. I'm glad that she did. There's a lot of my universes that I believe are aligning in this moment. And Nicole's mentorship has meant a lot in many ways to that. And so the scholarship specifically, I replicated the survey. I made some adaptations, but I replicated the survey exactly 1 year later. So my data is now, we have data from the beginning of the pandemic. And now we have also data from this past April in May. And so with 2 time points, and a lot of the narratives are getting at the emotional kind of toll and the time toll that COVID is taking. And so while I'm in the preliminary stages, one of the things, there's been some themes that have emerged just from looking at it. And one of the things I wanted to mention too is I feel a sense of responsibility. And I think a lot of times people that do qualitative work will speak to that. I have been a quantitative methodologist, and that's my work has been quantitative. And I haven't felt this sense of responsibility and empowerment until I did this work. And so now I feel as though these stories must get out because they've taken the time, they've entrusted me with these stories, and there's a lot of them, and there's a lot of overlap. So Nicole's data, so the 2020 data, really, there was a lot of fear and a lot of anxiety that was expressed, and justifiable. This was April and May of 2020 when things were just kind of getting started and folks were not sure exactly what was going to happen. The second round of data collection, the emotions transitioned to some ways, so some apathy, exhaustion, despair. And one constant in both rounds in the 2020 and 2021 data is anger. Academic mothers are pissed off, and we're angry for a lot of justifiable reasons. And so what does that mean? And so I'm really in the end, I'm ultimately interested in getting more into the data to examine if there's a difference between graduate student mothers and other mothers. We also have a measure to extract and to look at funded versus unfunded graduate students, and then by discipline. So there's a lot of really good information there. One other thing I wanted, so we know that there was already a leaky pipeline for women, and more so for mothers in graduate school, and many are now faced with the unimaginable decisions of whether to continue their programs, fulfilling their academic dreams, or leave the academy altogether. And so hopefully this work and the work of PhD mamas combined can help amplify those voices, and we'll be reading more about it hopefully soon.
Right. So then, is there anything that you've identified in terms of fixing that pipeline and those gaping holes that you mentioned? Have other people come to you with ideas, or are there ideas that you've kind of come up with that you'd like to share today?
Sure. The one thing, and I mean, there's definitely more than one thing, but one of the things that I have found to be what we'll call a gap in what was needed is the idea of including diversity, equity, and caregivers and mothers as part of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. I believe that there is a political climate, especially within institutions, where there is an investment and an appreciation of DEI. And in those, we want to ensure that we are considering caregivers as part of that, because there's an entire scholarship and action-based design around how we can make more equitable spaces. And so I feel that because we don't have to reinvent the wheel, we just need to kind of become part of that conversation. One of the things, the other thing that I do in my spare time is I've been doing some DEI consulting with actually the co-administrator of PhD Mamas, which is my master's advisor. So we've remained friends over 20 years, Dr. Rhonda Matthews, and she is at what I believe will be formerly known as Edinburgh University. So she got kind of in that sweep up of the Pennsylvania system. And her and I are doing some diversity work in the Erie area, and we'll also be transitioning that to online, where diversity is more than some of the things, race and gender and sexuality, but also caregiving, motherhood status. And if we want the best, that's the message. If we want the best, if we want the best students, if we want the best faculty, then we need to really be inclusive of that information and of those people. And how do we do that? But to really invest in initiatives to increase.
And that was something that I think came up in the first talk too, that you may have remembered, was using that department and the resources therein to maximize the work that we're doing and to gain the visibility that I think many of us believe is very, very important for graduate student mother scholars. So Mari, thank you for joining us today as well. So one of the questions that I had for you is that we talk a lot about sort of the systems in place that are already preventing mothers and parents in general, but mothers in the case for today's conversation, from really participating in graduate school programs the way that others might. But I was wondering then, when you add in some of the other complexities that typical departments are dealing with in terms of class and race, some of the diversity initiatives, how do you think that layers on into the conversation?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's such a big question, of course, and very complex, but, Jess was just pointing to some of it in terms of how are we imagining who the studentship is, right? And I think actually in your first panel, that was a part of the conversation as well. The imagined student is a white male, unencumbered, no other responsibilities. Jess, you were talking about the, the inflexibility of, you need to be here for every minute of the class and beyond. And because if I decide that I need another 15 minutes, there's no need to go home. There's no one you have to get home for, right? So, I mean, of course, when you start thinking about those things, it's certainly not only mothers, and it's certainly not only racialized others, but where it becomes this sort of transversal identity constellation for me is the idea of, there are so many stories and narratives and controlling images of how certain bodies and bodies of knowledge enter the system. And so if you are now a racialized student, you were here on a diversity quota. You are not necessarily deserving of this space. So you compound that with the mother bias or the motherhood bias, that you are deemed an unreliable, you don't take your work seriously, you can't devote every waking moment to the work of the academy, of your supervisor, of your course, of your on and on and on. You can't make it to every event. You can't do all the networking. You can't travel. I mean, that's all very deficit, right? And I'm drawing out the problematics. If you take that in conjunction with now being positioned as not even deserving a space because of your race or your class background, that imposter syndrome that I think many of us have talked about carrying with us, and I suspect I see Jess nodding her head personally, but also probably in that data as well, that I don't belong here. This is not a system that was ever designed for me. It gets layered and layered and layered. And then you start to think about, okay, well, why don't they just ask for help? Because if you ask for help, now you're showing you don't know the system that you are being told you don't belong in, through these grand narratives of belonging, through these grand narratives of, again, who that ideal student is by the very structures in place. So, I mean, I think what I like to do is start with the axiom that the university is imperial, it's white supremacist, it's hetero-patriarchal, it's working on capitalist and neoliberal logics. So we need to just start with that as a premise. Now, these are not hermetically sealed moments. And that's why I love the image that Catherine, that you have behind you. And I believe you might speak to it later, but because of some of the correspondence, you know, the ways in which we, there's this wonderful book out by La Paperson, and it's called Third Worlding the University, right? The ways in which we from within do something other than what the university demands of us, while we also understand our complicity within it. So, you know, whenever you're outside of the normative, you are constantly kind of put back on your heels. So whether that's a gendered normative, a class normative, a race normative, whatever, and abilities normative, you are constantly having to prove yourself. So to say, no, I cannot participate in that, no, I have boundaries, becomes an even greater risk. And we saw that heightened in the responses to Simone Biles saying, no, I will not compete. How that was read on her body is read differently than if it were a white male athlete who, oh, good for him for taking care of his body. The stories we tell around the actions, the same actions, they materialize differently, and they have different consequences for different students, right? And so again, if you think about who is selected, and I think this came out in the first, when was it? About 10 days ago, the first chat that you had. Sorry, I should have taken note of the date. Anyway, one of the conversations was, and I appreciate that suggestion, like on the equity, diversity, and inclusion committees, we need to also have caregivers to give that voice. But we don't want that then to be the only place where they have voice, because we have learned from the racialized, minoritized, other populations on campus that with this now surge of EDI, they are overtasked. They are doing extra labor that doesn't get counted. They are on committee after committee after committee after committee. They are being asked to mentor any othered student, right? So they're just being pulled to the phrase. And guess what? When it comes time for now, oh, well, who are we going to feature for our Scholar of the Month? Who is the academic? Who is being presented as the face, not the face of, look, we are diverse, but the face of, look, here is scholarship. It's rarely those populations. So you just need to like recognize how all of these things come into play and shape the contours of possibility for either pushing yourself to the limit, and the recidivation, maybe that's not the right word, the rate of racialized mothers leaving the academy is astronomical, right? And so we need to take a look at, I'm not a numbers person, and Jess and I have talked about this before, and I so appreciate the numbers people, because I think the numbers do tell really important stories, and I want to get in there into the heartfelt and the emotional aspects of it. But those numbers, that's not that these women don't want to be there, or it's not, oh, you know, the whole neoliberal, well, that's not your place. Now you're getting into really, really muddy waters to say, well, that's not your place. You go and stay over there. You do the caregiving, you do the whatever else, right? That aligns with your race, class, ability, gender, background. So once we start allowing ourselves to just become complacent and not say, wait a second, these numbers are saying something. So we need to understand what else is happening and to get at those complexities. So let's look at the numbers and let's try to draw out more of the stories from both, you know, graduate student mothers who are racialized or coming maybe first generation, lower socioeconomic status. They don't necessarily know that you can go to this person or this department, because this is all new. This is a completely new world. And guess what? The university is really obtuse. You know, I always laugh, like going from, you know, going, through K-12 school, teaching in the K-12 system, going into undergraduate and graduate school, and then having a postdoc. You think you understand the system. And then I got my assistant professor position, was like, oh my gosh, I did not know anything about this. Well, I wouldn't say anything, but there was so much more to the world I didn't know. And so that's part of the work, is trying to demystify it, providing access to the culture of power. How do things work here? What are the risks? And being in conversation with the students around some of those things. So yeah, those are some of the things that I think about.
And I love the way your brain thinks. I've said that many times in past conversations with you, Mari, and you've certainly put that on full display today, of the way that you're able to think both about those macro structures, but not overlook the individuals that are very much part and parcel of those bigger systems and are being impacted by it. And I know from past conversations we've had that you take your mentoring very seriously as well. And so I wanted to think a little bit through, we don't want to task this as an individual problem, because it's not. On the other hand, there are things that we can do in these one-to-one relationships to make that dissemination of knowledge about these systems potent and useful. And so I wanted to talk to you a little bit more about how you approach that mentoring relationship, and how you might advise people that maybe are not in a mentoring relationship yet, how to advocate for themselves, to have somebody, from the inside be able to help them navigate some of that, all of those sorts of things that I think, as somebody, I came from a very working class background too, those things were mystifying to me. I didn't even know to ask, because it wasn't part of the family that I grew up in, So what are some of the things that you feel like you can shed light on in terms of that relationship, and how to make it a successful one?
Yeah, thank you for that. And I appreciate the way that you started the point, because I know in much of my kind of social justice, anti-racist activism work that I do, when we start looking at the structures and systems, which are necessarily where our focus needs to be, it is really easy to go, well, what on earth can I do? And so when I work with students just around, content-wise, that kind of work, it's, what's the one thing you can focus on? What's the little moment that you can grasp to make a change right here, right now? Or there's never any guarantee that change will happen, but that you can at least be working towards change in some future capacity. So yeah, the focus on the individual. I try to be very open with my students. So we just had a brand new cohort of doctoral students begin at the University of Calgary, well, the Werklund School of Education specifically within the University of Calgary. And upon our first meetings, and I don't gender this at all, it was just kind of a, let's just chat one-on-one, say hi, we'll get into the institutional. We have, wonderful checklists that we get to do with our students when they come in, and we're going to be supervisors of them. But I said, we talk about that there is this checklist, and we're going to put it off to the side, because I want to start with relationships first. And some of the conversations that I have are, I'm not very structured or rigid in terms of I meet my students every week or every month, or we need to be in regular communication, and there will be moments where we meet every week, and there will be moments where we might meet once in a term, but we need to be in communication with one another about that. And furthermore, there are times of the day, particularly during the school year, and my heart is racing, because we also have a no mask rule in effect, and that non-choice that families are given about whether or not their kids can go to school or should go to school is anyway, that's a whole nother layer of stress you can add to your surveys. But that idea that, COVID aside, I will be picking up my children, so I'm not really available. I can coordinate with my partner. I do have that availability, but on the whole, I've made a decision that I will be picking up my children, so there's a time of the day where I just am not available. And I've been more vocal. Since I actually just got my tenure and promotion in July, and I've been more vocal about saying that for colleagues as well. Like, I'm sorry, I can't do an afternoon exam because it bucks up on when I need to do, pick up for my children. On a rare occasion, I'll be like, okay, fine, everyone else is fighting. I'll support the student in this way. But I share that with them. as an opening, as an invitation for them to also say to me, and it doesn't have to be around childcare, but you know, if you have something, don't let me trying to schedule a meeting with you and only offering 3 times, because I do try to be very guarded with my time, especially when it's time when my children happen to be around. So you know, if I'm not offering you times that work, don't feel like you need to squeeze into that. Right back and say these times don't work. So we have that conversation from the get-go to say you need to set your boundaries. This should not take every minute of your life. You probably have other things going on in your life, right? Rather than that every waking moment, it is intense work, and especially when you're passionate about it and you want to be doing the writing, you know, and all of those kinds of things. So yeah, so just trying to open those kinds of spaces very purposefully with my students. But I'll just, if I can, just provide 2 other examples of things that I did with even more purposefulness. Like that's more that one-on-one relationship aspect. But the research project that I'm working on right now is funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, which is the national funding body for my area of research here in Canada. And, you know, when writing the budget line, you have to, you know, have a rationale for your budget. So I put in that I wanted graduate students, but I also included my research is looking at mothers of school-age children who are navigating the tenure track. And so I put in there that I was going to purposefully hire 2 graduate students who were also mothers of school-age children and 2 graduate students who wanted future academic jobs, because I wanted to, again, have them be a part of these conversations with the other mothers who were talking about the different things that they've been navigating. So it was this mentoring, it was uncovering what actually happens, what this lived experience is like, not just the stories of what you get to do as a professor, because again, I think many of those are myths. So I wrote that in very purposefully. And I shared that with my graduate students. And so from the get-go, we established this relationship where, again, we needed to be in communication with one another. And so I had wanted them, we had talked about this, Katie, we really wanted them to participate in this panel. And then they had agreed to, and they said contingent on when it is. And then as it got closer, it happened to be during the time where they are both writing their comprehensive exams. And so I'm in the School of Education, they're in the Faculty of Social Work, but they have a slightly different system than we do. And they have I'm even going to call it an old school system that they get their 6 questions that they get to choose 3 of them and have to write, you know, 20 to 25 pages in response to each. So you're looking at 60 to 75 pages, and they have to do it in 3 weeks. This does not take into account how people write. Okay. This does not take into account what other responsibilities people have in their lives. It is an arbitrary deadline that, again, has an ideal student on the other side of it. And that ideal student doesn't include my students who are graduate student mothers, right? And so I said to them, I'm not going to de-agentize you and say you cannot participate, but I will put in my calendar, and this is what ultimately wound up happening after the conversation, I will put in my calendar when you are doing your writing for your exams, because it's not at the same time. So one is writing right now and the other one's about to write. And so anyway, so I was like, I will put it in my calendar and I will not bother you. We will not, you know, schedule any interviews for our research participants in the research that we're doing during this time. And so I modeled for them, it's okay to block out times and say no to other things. And again, I had to be careful because I didn't want to de-agentize them. I didn't want to take this opportunity from them, but they both just said, thank you. Yes, I don't want another thing that I have to prepare for as I'm under the, you know, the timelines for writing this very important aspect of my milestone in this trajectory on the PhD. So those are just some of the ways that I try to be very explicit, try to model, try to be in conversation, and that all requires being in relation with your students as well. And they're not just, I think that was important, Jess, they're not just students, right? There's so much more. They're that and humans and mothers and partners and daughters and on. So.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mari. And with that, you know, we were talking about defending students and, you know, from that side of things, but also how to think part of the question was also talking about, how as a graduate student, do you find the people that need to mentor you and or want to mentor you, and how to find an effective mentor. And I know Catherine Riley has been doing some work around that with her own on her own campus. And I was hoping that you could explain, maybe kick us off by explaining the background that you've chosen to use today.
Yeah, so I have been researching not just student mothers, but also student fathers, so student parents and pregnant and parenting students is what we say, they're partners as well. And I like to segue from what we were just talking about, because there's so many different ways you can argue for why they need to be included, from humanitarian standpoints, from race diversity standpoints, from religious standpoint, whatever is the platform of your school or your background, you can argue from it. But you can also argue it from a legal perspective. And that's where Title IX comes into play, because Title IX has the force of a law and the threat of litigation behind it. So it kind of is scary for some people. My favorite was when I presented this information to an athletics department, and other departments were like, okay, yeah, whatever. And then the athletics department was like, our students can sue us about this? And then they started writing down stuff. I'm like, yes. So Title IX was created in 1972, and it says verbatim, no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation, be denied the benefits of, or subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. And so on the basis of sex has come to be understood to include pregnancy and parenting status, including for any partners, like male figures that are part of this process. And since 1972, there's been various regulation and guidance documents that have been produced. Most importantly, in my opinion, I mean, they all matter, but most recently there was one in 1991 that sort of got forgotten about. So then in 2013, the Department of Education and the Office of Civil Rights republished it and were like, hey, you have to pay attention to this. And that listed all of the things that schools have to be doing for their students under the Title IX office. Now, Title IX, when people think about it, students, faculty, staff, even Title IX coordinators sometimes at schools often associate it with athletics. So if you have X amount of male sports, you have to have the female sports, has to be balanced, has to be equal. And then some people also think about it for sexual and gender harassment, sexual violence, sexual assault, those things. But it also relates to pregnancy and parenting. The problem is that not everybody realizes that. So when something comes up, they don't necessarily go to the Title IX office. But the Title IX office is where you can get the force of legal action to make accommodations happen. That is the job of the Title IX office. But again, people don't know about it. So to put things into perspective, until 2010, and this came out in 1972, so until 2010, there were only 13 cases of all the judicial cases, 13 cases that alleged pregnant and parenting students discrimination under Title IX. And between 2010 and 2020, there weren't very many more either. And if you look at, so those are actual cases, but if you just look at complaints that were submitted to the OCR, Office of Civil Rights from the Department of Education, I have the data all the way back from 2015, but if, for example, let's look at last year, 2020, under Title IX, there were 1,264 complaints about athletics related problems. There were 472 complaints about gender harassment, sexual assault. These are complaints that made it all the way to the ED that didn't get resolved at the school level. And there were 7 complaints about pregnancy and parenting. We all know there are more than 7 problems in the US with pregnancy and parenting, but why did only 7 get reported? Because students don't know that they can go to the Title IX office. And even if they do, another problem that comes up is Title IX offices are, they have limited resources, they have limited staffs and personnel, and wherever the data is, that's what gets all the resources. So if students are not coming to them, they can't argue that they need more resources, they need more support to help these students, so they don't really do much. Like, for example, I went to a Title IX coordinator at a school and said, hey, this needs attention. He said, well, that's nice, but we don't have time for that. I'm like, you have to have time for that. So more students going to them will create more time because the data will be there. They will, and it's part of their job. They know it's part of their job. But if they have all of these other cases that they have to work with, that's what gets the attention. So Title IX is there, and it has this force behind it. It's strong, it's necessary. It just has to be utilized. I love that there's a book that Bush and Thoreau wrote about Title IX a couple years ago, focusing mostly on athletics and sexual assault. But they point out that laws are not really effective unless they are applied and enforced, which brings up the question, even if students do know about Title IX, which of all the students we interviewed for our book, one knew that Title IX applied to them, which is alarming. Even if students do know about Title IX, why don't they do something? I know of multiple cases that probably could have resulted in lawsuits. Well, there's a number of things that happen. For one, as all of us know from being pregnant in school or parenting in school, you don't really have a lot of time to get a lawyer, to go to court. You just want to put your head down, get in, get out, and graduate. And then it perpetuates the system of under support for all of these students. So that's really unfortunate. Another reason that we don't see a lot of cases, like why were there only 13 court cases about that during all those years? And it was very, very hard to find those. I worked with this research on a Title IX coordinator that's a lawyer, is co-authoring my book with me. And it took her a long time to find those. Like, she did serious digging. And there's a couple reasons for that. To actually win a case, you have to do 4 things. To prove a violation of Title IX, a plaintiff must prove she was a member of a protected body, so prove she was pregnant, prove she was parenting. That she was performing the academic requirements at a level well enough to meet her educator's legitimate expectations. So she was doing what she was supposed to do, and then the school or the professor or something was like, no, we don't want you to continue here. She suffered adverse treatment, discrimination, hardships, whatever you want to call it, depending on the situation. And 4, that the educational program continued to instruct and credit other students. So showing that there was a discrepancy between how this student was treated and how that student. And then you can sort of, from those 4 things, point out inequities and problems. It's hard to do in court because that's a lot of parts that have to be met. So that results in not a lot of court cases actually coming to fruition, even if there really was a problem. Even though that's sort of unfortunate, the benefit, though, of still having Title IX, even if it doesn't go all the way to federal courts, is that a Title IX coordinator knows all of these things still have to happen. So the ideal, and this is what the Department of Education has created, is that a Title IX coordinator can help a student at the school level before a complaint ever even gets resolved. They can de-escalate things, basically. If a faculty member does something and the student's like, that's wrong, they can go to the coordinator and the coordinator can clap some hands, get things back in line, and then nothing has to de-escalate. That's how it should work. People should find the support that they need before things have to go up the ladder. So that's the ideal. But this is how Title IX works, and it's really strong, and because it is a law, and you can't really debate laws. You can debate about who should be included, what's right, what's wrong from other standpoints, even though a lot of us would disagree with those. It is debatable, but laws exist, whether you like them or not.
So how do you, I mean, because you outlined sort of the trickiness and thorniness of proving this, and that was one of the things that many of the stories that I hear, and I experienced myself being a pregnant graduate student mother, were things that were hard to quantify, because it'd be one of those, oh, you're pregnant again. Like these just sort of passing comments, or the sort of, there's a vibe, there's a, and I'm not trying to say that, how would a graduate student, from your point of view, be able to address some of those sort of less tangible moments where you're certainly feeling sort of where the law should be on your side, but it'd be very hard to describe or put into some sort of provable kind of framework?
Yeah, that's an important question. So the Department of Education recommends that you record these things, that you write them down, and maybe something doesn't, they're not, you can't incriminate somebody in a court case, but you can take that information to the Title IX office and say, look what is consistently happening, and they can address it before it becomes worse. We have, like, the Clery Act, we do, as professors, we do a lot of training for that, to prevent workplace discrimination on a lot of other subjects. And the same can apply here. Before something becomes bigger, you nip it, you record it, you report it, and it can be stopped in its tracks. That's what the Department of Education recommends, and that's why the Title IX coordinators are in place. It might be a matter of like talking to your supervisor, but if they're part of the problem, go to the Title IX coordinator. And the more they hear from people about this, the more they're going to realize they have to address this. And then maybe the school will start giving them some funding for this. But some of the other things besides just like those culture related comments, like I had a professor one time when I was applying to grad school said, you might want to not wear your engagement ring. And like, I got where she was coming from, but also I think that just made it worse. Like you're perpetuating this culture. So some of the other things besides comments are students need to know that they're allowed necessary accommodations under Title IX. If you need accessible seating, if you need bathroom breaks, if you need a seat during lab, those things are required under Title IX. You need to be able to return to the same status, not a different status from when you left, but the same status, protect you from harassment, some of the things Katie brought up. You can participate in extracurricular activities. This is something I see in our interviews. People being kicked out of clubs, kicked out of sororities. The sorority is tricky because they have a funny status that allows them to be all female. So they can discriminate against males because they want to be all female and vice versa with males. But that doesn't necessarily mean you can discriminate against pregnancy. So some of these clubs are tricky, but you're not supposed to be excluded under Title IX. So there's a whole series of medical related absences, makeup work. If it's medically required, it's supposed to be excused. If students don't know these things, they can't get those rights.
So, and how do we, I mean, one of the things that we sort of have been echoing here is how do you find the people that are your allies as a graduate student? It's very hard to just sort of walk and be like, hey, so, and point blank questions, but what are some of the things that either those that are in a mentoring relationship can do to sort of advertise their ally position, or what are some things that graduate students could do to sort of suss that out on their own?
Yeah, I think the most important thing to start with, or at least the easiest way, because some of the changes that need are huge structural policy changes that would take a long time, and those should happen. But the first place I think that you can start easily is with visual communication. So I like to compare, a lot of people have the safe space ally stickers on their office doors. Why don't you have one of these? I made all of these. I'm happy to share. Because it creates a culture of support. If we saw these everywhere, and I asked interviewees, what do you think of these? How would you feel if you saw these? And we're like, that would be so nice, because you never know who's there. And even if someone doesn't need it, like even if students never become pregnant and parenting students, seeing this reminds them to be inclusive. It reminds them that this population exists, because otherwise it's a pretty invisible population. Visual communication is key, but just having this is kind of, it's a nice symbol, but it might not do anything. So that's where you can switch to doing a little bit more and maybe start with some handouts. What do you have available? So that's in addition to this on your office door, in your office, whether you're a grad student and you have undergraduates that you work with, or you're an undergraduate and you have friends, or you're a professor and you have students come and go in your office, wherever your space is on campus, you can have this. And you can also have information that complements it to show what does it mean to be supportive. So my students that I was working with and can you see the shared screen, everybody?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So we created a document like this, and your school could create something similar. We have Title IX right up here because that has a nice strong force to it. And then we quickly put up some frequently asked questions students might ask. And then on the back, we have what are local resources and what are campus resources. Unfortunately, this campus didn't have a ton, but we found what they did have. Title IX coordinator, the Women's Center, and then we have like lactation rooms, which we don't have very many, but if you start using the 2 you have, then maybe there will be 5. And really important is getting students connected with some of the networks, like Jessica was talking about, like PhD Mamas or this group, or any of the other places in town that have things. One of the moms I talked to really liked the Buy Nothing Facebook group in her community, or the fact that there's like library free classes for kids. Students don't know about those things, or even graduate students don't know about them because they're coming from out of town. And as one student said, none of her friends were parents and local parents weren't her friends. So Where does she get recommendations for this stuff? Having these things in our offices, having them in our dorm rooms, even if we don't need them yet, somebody might. Or seeing them reminds people that this population exists, that resources are out there in case you ever need them. And it starts ending the silence and starting recognition of a population and resources and growing those resources.
And seeing who else on campus may have kids, to be honest, because I know that some campuses don't even permit kids on campus. And so again, short of a direct ask or somebody volunteering that information, you may not even know really how many of the people in your cohort might be parenting or going through other caretaking responsibilities in that way. So definitely, I love that you're bringing up the visibility, both in very concrete ways, but also from a theoretical standpoint. So at this point, we wanted to open up the discussion to those that have joined us today. No question is too small. You are welcome to ask a specific panelist a specific question, or you can just say, hey, I have this bigger question. Whoever wants to take it, please chime in. There's no real method to the madness here other than we'd love to hear from you. And it can also be sometimes just sharing stories of what you might be going through, testimonials of a sort. So you're welcome to share any of those things in the chat box or via the Q&A option, which is likely at the bottom of your screen. If you are on a phone, you may have to hit the more button to get that option to come up. But in the meantime, I did have a couple of the questions just while other people are kind of formulating their thoughts about, we talked a lot about sort of the visibility, but also I think with that comes a transparency issue from the university side. I think one of the things that was brought up in the last talk that I found really, really important, and I think Jessica highlighted it as well, is the idea that graduate students, I think for fair reason, don't feel like they're a very powerful body as a collective whole, but certainly not as an individual either. And so I think there's that. And there's also, I don't even want to, perhaps shame, but I think that there is that sort of not necessarily wanting to out yourself as a parent, because then, if a paper is late, then it's like, oh, well, that's because, and you don't want to have that sort of false causation or correlation going on. So that sort of stuff. So I think one of the things we've talked a lot about at IMS is how to push universities into a role where this information is readily available and not having to be asked for. And so I was wondering, what are some of the other ways that you've seen transparency done well or not done well in various circumstances, so that other students can either feel like there's a point from which they can advocate, or perhaps if you're on the other side of things and you are in a faculty position, things that you feel might be something worth bringing to your students. And that's for obviously anybody here who wanted to chime in on that.
I'll start. Something really fast that I advocate in the conclusion of our book is for schools to be proactive in providing information about rights, realities, rates, and resources, the 4 R's, before students ever need them, like during orientation, whether that's an undergrad or graduate, because it's not something that they're going to seek out until they're desperate. And when they're desperate, they're not going to be like doing thorough research. So some students that I spoke with loved when, and this didn't happen very often, but when it did, it was great, when they were new students in a graduate program, for example, and they got a packet of all these things related to children and parenting in that college town. Like, how much forethought was that? And they just gave it to all the students in case they needed it. It's a really great symbol of inclusion and really practical for a lot of students. So doing things like that are proactive and inclusive from the get-go is inclusive and really helpful, practically speaking.
Were there other people who want to chime in on that, or maybe not? But we do have a comment from in our chat box that says, hi, everybody. Thanks so much for hosting this. I felt very lost during grad school and my unplanned pregnancy and would have loved to have these resources. Is there any specific protections for pregnant students who have to complete placements? For example, teaching student and social workers. It sounds like it might be Catherine, but Jessica and Mari, if you want to chime in, please do.
Well, I actually interviewed someone with the very same thing as well, and her department head said, "Sorry, I can't help with that. But if you're getting course credit for these placements, then I'm, as far as I'm aware, I mean, I can double check with the lawyer that's working with me, but as far as I'm aware, if you're getting course credit, it falls under Title IX. So there should be, and that would be a question you take it directly to your Title IX coordinator. If you can't work it out with a faculty member, that's where it should go. And what happens is if the Title IX coordinator and the school don't fix it at that level, you file a complaint with the Office of Civil Rights, and then it gets addressed because the Department of Education is serious. So that would be where to go, because it's part of your education.
So one of the next questions is, are there recommendations for funding sources for tuition for doctoral moms? I think it's public knowledge now, but just barely, that IMS has coordinated with Academic Mamas Foundation, and we will be offering grants. To be honest, the information is so new that I don't even think that part of our website is yet public, but my email address is a little bit further up in the chat box, and you're welcome to email me directly and to get more information on that. But we should be launching that part of our website in the next couple days. And there's the nice thing about those specific grants is that they do cover, living costs or travel costs. It could be anything that is related to your education or not. So it's really whatever keeps you in that seat and continuing your education. So again, I may repost, thank you, Barrett, for reposting my email address. And I think that SWS has some similar programs that Barrett may want to highlight.
Sure, I can highlight the fact that this year we have a member emergency fund, a systemic racism fund, and a victim advocacy fund. And there are applications on our website that members can fill out to apply for those funds. So I can put that information in the chat as well.
Great. And certainly funding is a big piece of the motherhood component when you're facing some of these challenges. And it's certainly, when we talked about the attrition rate, I think Mari was bringing that up, of how many mothers are not able to stay in. It's because oftentimes you are looking at so many additional expenses. It's a time where even under the best of circumstances, with a full-time job and social resources and all of those things in a community, perhaps where you have family, those early years of parenting can be so daunting. But then you add in these other complexities, then I think it wouldn't take much of imagination to see where it would get very challenging to do so. So one of the other things that we've sort of highlighted and have talked a lot about amongst ourselves over the past couple of weeks is the idea of some of the things that Catherine has been alluding to in terms of legal protections that are very concrete. And then there's also these sort of issues of culture. And so IMS has what we call the Momo Award, which is the Making Opportunities for Mothers in Academia program. And that is to highlight, when Nicole Wiley and I started that conversation, one of the things that she rightfully brought forward in it was that it's not so much just the programs that these schools are offering, but whether or not people are accessing them and using them in a place that feels comfortable, basically. So the fact that you can have great programming, but if there's just sort of the cultural understanding that you're not going to take maternity leave, you're not going to take your full paternity leave, you're not going to ask for extensions, then that's a whole different can of worms. And so that was one of the things I wanted to talk to all of you about today, was how do you sort of, if you are perhaps on a campus that maybe or maybe not has the formal programs, how do you get the cultural shift to fall into place if it's not already there?
I'm no good at giving the material answers. Catherine, thank you so much for your concrete, this is very serious. And I love the way that you hung it on the law. And, I am from the United States, so I understand Title IX, and I'm thinking in my head, what is similar here? What do we have for protections along those lines in Canada? You know, I mean, that whole idea of shifting the culture is a really difficult one. And I'm not going to give any answers, but that, I mean, I know when I talk animatedly about my research, you know, oh, that's cute, you're doing research on mothering, you know, and how it just gets sort of like pushed to the side and, you know, fine, whatever. A student who is going to be presenting at IMAS at the fall conference, you know, went to her supervisor to ask if he was okay working with me. Like I said, I would support her because it's not directly aligned with her doctoral research at this time. I was like, I can work with her, but I'm not going to step on a supervisor's toes. And he made a quipping comment about, and this is a very close colleague to me. Like I value the work that he does very much, but he made a quipping comment about like, yeah, but don't worry, I'm not going to come to the conference. And I was like, what? Why wouldn't you come to the conference, right? So I don't know that I have like a real, but I know I've made it. I mean, it's been hard because it's in COVID and he is a close colleague, but I know I've made it like a point to be in like conversation with him and just make it ever more present. And again, it's that's not going to make a huge culture shift, but if there's like one kind of like hole in the wall that I can tap away at, I might work on it, you know? So, you know, it's the little things as well as the big things. And then, you know, just other things. Like I know when I was hired, my then dean, I said, you know, you are a mother, you know, and it kind of irritated me, but it also kind of didn't. And he was like, you need to be both mother and scholar. Like he was kind of calling on me. This was before I stepped into the world of motherhood studies and whatnot. So, I mean, just even like those little things can shift cultures. But it's not going to be a dramatic shift, right? None of that's going to happen overnight. But I think the more conversations we have, which is something I heard with Catherine too, even when you have these policies in place, that doesn't mean that that's what is going to be experienced. If people are not, I mean, law, what was the phrase used? It only works if it's put to work, you know, right? So how do we put it to work? And we need to speak up. And that's part of what I think IMS does and SWS among other organizations.
Can I chime in too as well? One of the things that I think is going to be important about changing culture is to just start, right? We just start. So I love the idea of putting something on the door. I also think of you know, conversations that I have and the supports that I have and the relationships that I have with undergraduate students and with graduate students and with other faculty, being authentic in who I am as a mother, and recognizing that that's okay. Even if it's not, and even if there's, and I'm coming from a place of privilege where I can do that now. I wasn't always there. I was a single mom in grad school. So my son was sitting there. My son came to class and I didn't always ask for permission, but my son sometimes had to come to class. And one of the other things is, you know, we can start affinity groups, we can create spaces and just start doing it. I love the handout, by the way, Catherine, that's perfect. But I think for culture to change, there is no way to say culture has to change. We just have to acting like just do it.
And I'm gonna jump from that. So I agree. There's you just have to do it. And I think Visual Way is a great place to start, but there's so many different places to start. So I actually have created this diagram that I was trying in my research to map, like, what is this going on? Why do people keep getting not supported? Schools don't support, they're supposed to support. What is happening? So I mapped it out and created a diagram that I think encapsulate. Hopefully it makes sense to you. You'll be the first people to ever see it. Let me share a screen really fast. So I call this the cycle of under support, and you can start anywhere, but let's start right here. So individuals become pregnant and parenting students, whether they enter school like that or they become pregnant while in school. But schools don't collect data about this. They don't know how many students they have. Nobody collects this data. And because they don't collect the data, and because students keep it private, as a lot of people are sharing, their peers, other pregnant and parenting students are unknown, especially people that have pregnancies that then don't show their pregnancies. They leave school, or they get an abortion, or they give the child up for adoption, or they keep them at home and don't tell anyone with their parents. Their peers are unknown, and their rights or resources are unknown because they don't look for them, schools don't publicize them. And then these students end up feeling isolated and atypical. They think that there's a lot less of them than they do, when in reality, 1 in 10 students experience an unplanned pregnancy at college age. And also like 1 in 5 undergraduates are parents. That's a crazy statistic, but nobody knows that. But it's true. That's the statistic. 1 in 5 are parenting students. But they remain silent, and their needs are not met by the school because there's no data and nobody knows. And then they struggle alone. So this cycle keeps continuing and continuing. But there's all these places in between where communication can help stop the cycle of undersupport. So we could collect data, or we could create an affinity group where student parents can come together in this group and allies, or we could create a pamphlet about rights and resources, or we could publicize that, hey, I'm a pregnant student too, or we can have decals on doors so that people don't feel isolated, that they don't feel abnormal. We can help them have voices and let them speak up and not feel like they need to hide. We can listen. Schools could do surveys like, what can we do to help you? And then give a survey of the pregnant and parenting students. Like for this, I had to email, there was no department on campus that serves this population that we're catering to today. So I had to email every single graduate student at our entire university just to hope I caught like some of the ones that it was relevant to. Why don't we have a list? Why don't we collect this data? This is ridiculous. And you can stop. So where to start to change the culture? Organizational change is a huge project, and you can start anywhere. And there's a lot of us. So if everybody starts somewhere, it can all concurrently be working towards change, which would be great.
I love that diagram, Catherine. You're so good at making the visual, so, things that intuitively, and then you see it and like, yes, that is exactly what's been going on. And thank you for sharing that today. And I think partly what you talked about is, we to some extent have been referencing more perhaps typical populations of a woman who may have or may not have a male partner, but I think that's somewhat where some of this conversation has been going. People that do carry through their pregnancy and have the child and don't give up for adoption. So some of these more sort of what you consider the normalized stories of mothering. But then I also wanted to touch on some of the issues that other students might be facing, whether they're in a same-sex couple and looking to adopt or looking to get pregnant. And how does some of that complicate then the narratives that we've been discussing, and where, to Catherine, perhaps specifically, how might Title IX kind of work with addressing those specific issues that are outside of some of the, again, quote unquote, normalized scenarios that we've been talking about. But certainly Jessica and Mari, if you wanted to chime in on how we can address and help support some of the populations that may not be what our first knee-jerk instinct is to think of, how might we bring people into that conversation and make it a welcoming and inclusive space?
Well, I'll start because I have the baseline and then you guys can jump to it. So Title IX, as my co-author, the lawyer, says, Title IX is a floor, not a ceiling. So you can use it to say you have to do these things. And then that's where all of the other arguments come in to say, yeah, but this is what we should be doing to be doing a really good job. Because Title IX is just the bare minimum. And we don't want to do the bare minimum. And we should tell our schools, that's embarrassing. Like, we expect our students to excel and do the best. So why are we doing the bare minimum? So it's a floor that we start from, and then we use all our other philosophical reasonings to argue for better.
Were there other points that, Mari, you wanted to add to that?
I would just add, again, I'm going to go more philosophical on things. I don't have the material responses, but being in a province that is relatively right-wing conservative here in Canada, the current government was in support for things like conversion therapy. So real horrific treatment of anyone who identified differently than their, medical doctor said they were at birth, among other things in terms of loving humans who might be of the same gender that they are. And so part of the work that, again, when you think about culture shift, is trying to even just normalize that they, hey, this is a population and they're human and they are loving and they are wanting to grow families in a variety of different ways. So just kind of making that even a public conversation, right? Getting into the difficult spaces for some students who are going to be challenged by, again, a conservative sort of religious backed rationale for why, particular populations are undeserving of life until they can conform more readily to the ideal human. And so, even just opening that kind of space to suggest that this is, I mean, again, that doesn't offer resources to the students themselves who are seeking, supports on campus or within community to be able to access services that can bring them, into the world of family in a particular kind of way. But it is something that makes it at least possible to identify oneself, right? And find others who maybe know the resources better. And that's something that I struggle with too. Catherine and Jessica, I think maybe both of you had talked about this. The whole university system is kind of reliant on this idea that we can all just up and move to a new place. And that when it comes to whether it's reproductive health, when it comes to community and networking, when it comes to having just supports, family that you could trust with your children, or whatever the case might be, wherever you are in your life, that presumption that we can just up and go as the ideal of being able to be a university student or being able to be a professor, again, it signals a certain ability for that kind of mobility. And we have to recognize, and I feel this for myself in a new city, how am I going to point my students to resources? I don't know the resources either, right? So I have work to do, as I've been in this world, to find the resources. I don't even know, starting from the campus, but then going out into the broader community where these sites exist. And I often learn about them from my students. Again, I'm in a faculty of education and I work very closely with social work students. So they're very connected with community, the students who have grown up here, and depending on the kind of research that they're doing. So, those are just some other considerations to put on the table in terms of the university life world.
Can I chime in real quick? And I'm just going to spit mine out because I was writing them down. Graduate school advocate for fertility treatments for graduate students in medical care. I think that that's important. Caregivers, open to caregivers. So if there's parental policies that include adoption, I think that's really important. Leave times that are not with penalty if students adopt during the time. The cultural shift would be changing the attitudes, right? But the policy shift would be the kind of implementing that students have that time if they need it. Recognizing domestic partnerships within some of these institutions. One of the things that I came up with that I didn't mean to fit into this space, but I think a mechanism for students to report concerns anonymously. I think that is one of the ways that we can make things that are, one of the words I said, this will enable institutional oversights to be corrected. We cannot be what we cannot see. And if departments, institutions, faculties, disciplines do not take into account the ways in which their practice excludes caregivers, right? Any caregivers, regardless of gender or sexuality, then they're going to be less productive, less adaptable to the changing world. And we recognize the contributions of caregivers as essential. So this is one way to put in place and be more inclusive.
And I think a lot of those things just have to be brought to attention. For example, at our university, we had pregnant and parenting undergraduate students, but the undergraduate student insurance policy doesn't cover students with dependents. You have to be just alone, no child. And that's ridiculous. And you also can't be on your parents' insurance with a grandchild. So these undergraduates that are fresh and 19, and they didn't know that. And why doesn't our school have that? Likewise, another school that I was working with, TAs and RAs could have dependents on their insurance, but not graduate students that weren't TAs and RAs. So then when they meet each other, they're like, you have it, but you don't. So these are just discrepancies that I don't think schools necessarily mean to do this. They just don't know it exists. And then if they do notice, nobody pushes for it to change. So somebody has to, and that's what we can do.
And I've had conversations with Cindy Harley, who is the woman who founded and has been overseeing Academic Mamas Foundation, which is the grant funding organization that I mentioned earlier. And she said that at one of the campuses she was on at some point in her career, I don't know which one, she said one of the deans or one of the administrators said, well, we don't have pregnant undergraduate students. And it's like, well, but we do. I mean, that's the sort of thing, again, that visibility, making sure that you're communicating with your school population, and that to not put that onus on the students to necessarily have to be the squeaky wheel, because nobody necessarily wants to be that. But if there's programs in place that you can dovetail or kind of align yourself with that are there, I think that makes things a much different and more welcoming situation to be in. So I think some of those things that, and Cindy and I then had talked is like, well, maybe if you don't have undergraduate pregnant students or parents on campus, it's because you've made your campus so inhospitable that they left. And that's not the option that I would hope anybody is hoping for either. So I think all of you have brought forward some amazing ideas. I think that we stayed true to the idea that there are certainly changes that we can implement on a personal level. We don't want to exclude the fact that we are all agents of change and we can do great work at that level and with others, in one-on-one relationships, but that this is not going to be solved simply by having a great mentor, that these are systems that have been in place for as long as the university system has been in place. And I think if anything, many of the people in the care work field along with me are seeing, of course, a lot of devastation and a lot of fear that surrounds COVID and like the research that Jessica's been doing. But there's also the silver lining in this, is that we have had to adapt in remarkable ways, and it has happened. If nothing else, we can then point to some of this and say, look, we did it when it was important to the university. So now let's do it when it's important to a student or many students, as the case may be. So certainly I think all of that needs to be part of the conversation moving forward, is maximizing what the past year and a half has dealt to us. But certainly the ideas that have been brought forward are worth sharing. And that's part of the reason that we will be offering a recording of this. It takes a little bit of time for, all the wizards to do their thing behind the scenes, but we will certainly have that up in the next couple days. And you're of course welcome to share with whomever you feel needs this information. We have another talk coming up later this month, and all of that is updated, less so on our website, certainly on Facebook under I Am a Feminist Mom, and also on Twitter under a similar handle. And I believe Barrett will also be sharing some of this on her social media channels, which perhaps you want to point out as well, Barrett.
Sure, I can put that in the chat or Facebook, and it's at SocWomen is our handle.
Yeah. So there's many different places that hopefully you can find the content. And certainly I think all of us, I know at least I am, but I would presume anybody who shared their email address today would be happy to point you in the right direction if they don't have the answers themselves. But we welcome you for being part of this talk today, and for everything that you've asked in terms of questions, but also again, because of the visibility. We're here together, and I think that makes us stronger in terms of sharing our voice and sharing our wisdom. And I thank you again, Jessica, Mari, Catherine, Barrett, and Summer for joining us today. And I look forward to seeing you all again soon. Bye.